cyberspace, my name is Garrett Mills and welcome to setting up a basic PHP development environment in Ubuntu. So I'm currently using Ubuntu version 16.04 long-term support. I'm using Unity, an overhead terminal called Guake running the shell fish. However, it is a derivative of bash, so all of the commands are the same. So to get started developing PHP in Ubuntu, there are three basic programs you need. The first one is called Git. Git is a version control software that is huge in the software world. And if you're not familiar with version control, basically what it is it tracks changes in your code over time using things called commits, which are just like change points. And it helps you keep track of when a problem happened, when a feature was introduced, and it helps multiple people collaborate on a project together effectively, efficiently, and quickly. And it's just an enormous time saver and life saver if you've ever had to debug some problems in your code. The next tool is PHP, which is something you'll obviously need to develop PHP in any platform, but we are going to be installing PHP version 7. Back versions of PHP are available for Ubuntu. However, version 7 is a stable release and is fully supported on Ubuntu, so we will be installing that. And then a program called Composer, which is a package manager for PHP. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in some tutorial videos. So we're going to get started, and because Linux is awesome, we can install all three of these things at once using one command: sudo apt install php git composer. Now, one thing to note is if you're using a different release, an earlier release of Ubuntu, you will need to replace apt with apt-get. However, in new releases of Ubuntu, apt-get has been replaced by just the program apt. So we can hit enter, enter our password. Take a quick look over these and hit yes. Alright, so once that command finishes running, we should have PHP, Git, and Composer all installed, and we can double check them individually by running their commands. So we can hit PHP-V to check the version, and so we can see we're running PHP version 7.0.8 for Ubuntu. We can check Git by running git --version, and we can see we're running 2.7.4, and then we can check to make sure Composer is installed by running Composer, and we should see standard 1.0.0 beta 2, Composer output, and help info. Right, now that we've got the basics out of the way, we can get to the meat and potatoes of actually setting up the development environment. So an important thing to realize is that PHP is a server-side language, which means rather than just JavaScript, which runs on the client, PHP is a language which runs on the server before the page is sent to the client. And that allows you to do things like securely store data in a database, interface with other web platforms, and it gives you more powerful control over what your users see. And so to develop PHP, we need something called a LAMP stack. That LAMP stack contains the web server and other tools such as like a database server like MySQL or MongoDB. And that allows us to run the entire server on our computer so that while we're developing it, we can real-time see the results of our code. So there are two ways you can go about doing this that we're going to look at in this video. The first one is through a tool called Scotch Box. Scotch Box is a virtual machine LAMP stack. And what that means is it's a full web server with database tools and mail server tools, and it runs in a virtual machine, which means it is completely separate from your computer. It runs in its own container so that it may use more system resources, but it keeps the packages separate from your system, especially in a environment such as Linux, where packages are updated constantly. It can be important to keep your development environment separate so that you don't accidentally break it with an update or something. However, say your computer doesn't have the resources to support that, or your processor just straight up doesn't support virtualization, we can install a LAMP stack directly onto the PC using a software called XAMPP, which is a pre-built LAMP stack for Linux. So right now we are going to look at installing Scotch Box as a virtual machine. If this doesn't sound like your cup of tea or your computer doesn't support virtualization, you can click the little annotation down in the bottom right hand corner to jump ahead to the part where we install XAMPP. So getting started installing Scotch Box, there's again 3 tools that we need to install to run Scotch Box. The first of which is called VirtualBox. Previously mentioned, Scotch Box is a virtual machine, and virtual machines run on a software called hypervisors. Hypervisors are just the software that run the virtual computers. It lets it interact with the CPU and the RAM and the storage and the networking, and it just helps it along, and it helps the user interface with that machine. VirtualBox is a free, open source, easy implementation of this that works across all platforms. So this is what our Scotch Box virtual machine will actually run on. The second tool is called Vagrant. Vagrant is a command line interface for VirtualBox and other hypervisor programs like VMware. It allows us to quickly clone pre-existing VMs such as Scotch Box, so that rather than have to build our own LAMP stack every time, we can take a LAMP stack that someone's already built in a virtual machine someone's already built. We can pull that down and install it on our computer with a single command. And that makes Vagrant an extremely powerful tool for not just Linux users, but users on all platforms. And then the last is, of course, Scotch Box. Scotch Box is a pre-built virtual machine that we pull down using Vagrant and run on VirtualBox. And it lets us interact with the web server and SSH into an Ubuntu shell. So we can get started by installing VirtualBox, downloading it from the VirtualBox for Linux download page, which I will have linked in the description. I'm currently on version 16.04 running a 64-bit processor. So I'm going to hit download and save file. Alright, so once that finishes downloading, we can go ahead and open whatever software you use to install .deb packages in Ubuntu. I use GDebi because it's lightweight and quick and considerably faster than the Ubuntu Software Center. Navigate to our downloads folder and install the VirtualBox package. So once that finishes installing, we can go ahead and open it up and verify that it installed properly. You should see a screen that looks something like this, and if you do, that means we've successfully installed VirtualBox and can move on to the next piece of the puzzle, installing Vagrant. So this is the Vagrant downloads page. I will have this linked into the description, and Ubuntu uses the same package system as Debian, which means we can download the 64-bit Debian package to install it on Ubuntu, and we will wait for that to download. So once that downloads, we can go ahead and open up our package installer, select the Vagrant package that we downloaded, and install it. One thing to note is if you see this message, don't really worry about it. Especially as a developer, it's good to have the latest and greatest, so to speak. The version on the Vagrant Up download page is generally just as stable as the one in the software channels, and it is more up to date. So you can ignore that message and hit install package. Right, once that's done, close out of your package manager, and if we open up a terminal, we can verify that Vagrant has been installed by running the command vagrant-v, and you can see I'm running Vagrant version 1.8.7. Now the last thing is to download and install Scotch Box. Now Scotch Box is installed via a Git repository, which means we clone it using that software we installed earlier, Git, to a folder on our computer. So right now we need to decide where you want the code folder to reside. I generally keep it in my documents folder for consistency and just keeping it out of the way. So I'm going to make a folder called code. And now if we open up our terminal, we want to navigate to that folder. So we can do cd to documents code. And so we should have a blank directory. Now once we're in here, you need to copy this git repository URL, which I will have linked to in the description, and we can run the command git clone and then paste that in, and then after that type the name of your folder. So I'm just going to name the folder Scotch, then hit enter and it'll clone the repository. So once that's done, if we do an ls, we can see that we have a folder called Scotch, which we can change into, and you should see three things in there: a public folder, this is where your code will reside, a readme folder, or a readme file, pardon, and a vagrant file. Now this vagrant file is important because it tells Vagrant what to do to run the virtual machine. So now, to start the virtual machine and get it set up, we run the command vagrant up. Now what this does is it tells Vagrant to read the vagrant file for instructions. And so since this is the first time we run it, it's going to download the virtual machine image. So the first time that we run this command, it's going to take a while because it's going to download a large file and install and set up the virtual machine, and then it'll launch it. After the first time, anytime you run Vagrant up, it will take considerably less time because the image is already on your computer and it just has to start the machine like any other computer. However, this first time it's going to download an approximately 3 GB image of Ubuntu from the Scotch Box servers. So we can go ahead and hit enter, and it's going to read the Vagrant file and begin downloading. Alright, so once that completes, we should have successfully downloaded, installed, and started our Scotch Box virtual machine. So from the Scotch directory on our computer, we can run the command vagrant ssh. And what this should do is drop us at a shell for our Scotch Box. Now you can see this is Ubuntu, and it's just running stock Ubuntu with their lamp stack on top of it. So one thing to note is if you're using Scotch Box, anytime you interact with the server's command line directly, you will need to do it through vagrant ssh, and you can only run vagrant ssh from this Scotch directory in order to access this Scotch Box. So now we can double check to make sure all the servers and things are running by navigating to 192.168.33.10. This is the IP address that Vagrant mounts the Scotch Box network adapter on. And if you see a page that looks something similar to this, it means you've successfully installed, set up, and are running Scotch Box. We can see a list of all of the passwords and usernames, as well as all of the tools installed. Now if you're like me, typing in an IP address every time you need to access your server gets a little annoying. So one last thing we're going to do is add a line to our hosts file that routes that through a domain name. So to do this, we have to have sudo permissions to edit the file etc/hosts. Now I'm using the program Vim. So we're going to move down, add a new line, type in the IP address 192.168.33.10, and give it any domain name. In my case, I'm going to call it dev.local. Save and quit. Now, if we navigate to dev.local, we see our Scotch Box, and dev.local is much easier to remember, and it's just a much nicer looking URL for development. So now that we've installed Scotch Box, you've got your lamp stack running properly. You can skip over the XAMPP setup tutorial and jump to setting up an IDE. Go ahead and click the annotation in the bottom right hand corner. So if you've decided not to install Scotch Box, we're going to walk through the process of installing XAMPP. XAMPP is a fully featured LAMP stack that runs on Ubuntu natively. So it won't run in a virtual machine, it'll just run on your computer. It's very popular. It runs on all three major platforms, and it contains major tools like Apache, PHP, and MySQL. So to get started, we're going to download the Linux version that corresponds to PHP version 7, which we installed. And so we can hit download. I'll have this linked in the description, and save the installer. So once the install script downloads, we can open a terminal, change to our downloads folder, and give the script read, write, execute commit permissions. So we can run chmod 755 and then the name of the installer. Then we execute the installer by running sudo / name of the installer, in this case XAMPP-Linux. Hit enter, put in our password, and it should launch a graphical installer. Just run through this. You might note this directory because that's going to tell you where to put your code. So just jot this down. It's /opt/LAMPP. Once the installer finishes, we can hit finish and it should launch the XAMPP control panel. If we hit manage servers, go ahead and close the annoying pop-up web page. Manage servers, we can start the FTP and MySQL server. And you should get 3 green lights. If for some reason one of the services doesn't start, such as say the web server or the MySQL database, the most common error is probably that you have another server started already running on that port. So for instance, there's already a web server running on port 80. The way to fix this is to go and disable the web server or uninstall it completely if you don't intend to use it, and then you should be able to hit restart on the Apache web server within XAMPP, and it should start right up and bind to that port. So we can verify that it's working by navigating to localhost, and you should see a welcome to XAMPP page, just general talking about what it has. So if you see this, it means you've correctly set up XAMPP and you are good to go. A few things to note is when you're not using them, it's a good idea to stop all the servers. It just reduces CPU overhead when you're not using them. Another thing is to note where you will put your code. So if you remember, during the installer we jotted down the directory /opt/lamp. That's where XAMPP was installed. So we navigate to our root directory /opt/lamp. Now this is the familiar XAMPP directory. Inside this directory there's a folder called htdocs. This is the public root of your web server. This is where all your code will go in order to be executed and served by the web server. If you know what you're doing, you could go ahead and delete everything in this folder because it's just stock XAMPP information. So if we right click and go down to delete, but you'll notice that we don't have write permissions in this folder, which is something we need to fix. Since this is in the opt directory, our user by default isn't given permission to access it, and this can have some issues, especially when it comes time to actually write and edit code. So we're going to fix that now. So to give our user ownership over this htdocs folder, we simply open up a command prompt and run sudo chown capital R user group username directory, in this case opt lamp htdocs, and now we should have write access to this folder. Now lastly, there's one other thing we need to do to finish setting the permissions, and that's change the user that Apache accesses the files as. So since we set ourselves as the owner of that directory, that causes problems for the web server. So we need to change the configuration to handle that. So we can do that by running sudo vim or whatever text editor opt lamp etc httpd.conf. Now we simply scroll down to find the user and group section. Once you've located the user and group lines, just change these to the same as you set for that directory. Save and exit. And you've successfully set up XAMPP. We're now ready to move on to choosing an IDE. Alright, now that we've installed our basic PHP tools and our development stack, it's time to choose what might be the single most important tool in your development environment, and that is your IDE. The IDE is the software with which you write all of your code. A good IDE can find and test errors, suggest code completions, and handle object-oriented resolutions natively, quickly, efficiently, and it makes it so much easier to write code than just having a text editor, especially as you start developing more advanced PHP applications. So there are two IDEs that I'm going to cover in this video, the first of which is PHPStorm. PHPStorm is created by a company called JetBrains, and it is the bleeding edge, top of the top, professional PHP development environment. So if you intend to develop large scale or if you intend to develop full time, PHPStorm is the way to go. It has every bell and whistle. It's very powerful. It's got Git integration. It can integrate directly with Vagrant, like we installed Scotch Box, so you can manage Scotch Box through PHPStorm, customizable, everything. The second object, or the second IDE, rather, is called Eclipse. Eclipse is a free alternative to the paid PHPStorm, and while it's not as fully featured as PHPStorm, Eclipse is still a very powerful and very good development environment. Now you may know Eclipse as a Java IDE, however the folks over at Eclipse also have a PHP IDE, which is also extremely powerful and is a great entry-level option, especially if you're just getting started into web app development. So right now we're going to look at installing and setting up PHPStorm, and so if you don't think that you're ready to shell out the not insignificant amount of money to buy a PHPStorm license, feel free to click the annotation in the bottom right hand corner to jump ahead to where we set up and install Eclipse. So now we're going to walk through installing and setting up PHPStorm in Ubuntu. Now obviously the first thing you're going to need to do is buy a license. You can download a 30-day free trial and follow the same setup instructions as I'm going to show you, and just see if you like it first before you do that, and then apply your license later. But at some point you're going to need to buy a license. So you can head over to the PHPStorm page on the JetBrains website and hit download now. I will have that linked in the description. We are running Linux, and hit download. Alright, once the archive finishes downloading, go ahead and open it in whatever archive manager you use, and extract the PHPStorm folder to whatever directory you want. In this case, I'm going to use my documents. Once the folder finishes extracting, we can open up a command prompt and cd into the PHPStorm folder. From here, we need to change directories into the bin folder and run /phpstorm.sh. This should install and set up PHPStorm. So we'll run through the installer. I do not have a previous version of PHPStorm installed. Accept the license agreement and either put in your activation code or JetBrains account. Once you put in your password, there are a few settings you can change initially. So key map scheme, IDE theme, and code editors. These are purely personal preference. It doesn't change the function of the IDE at all. It just changes how it looks. So hit yes to restart. And there is one other thing we need to do to make sure it's ready. We need to tell PHPStorm where to find PHP. So to do this, we go to Settings, Languages and Frameworks, PHP. Then change the language level to 7. Hit the 3 dots and hit Add to add a new interpreter. And then it should pop up with user bin PHP because that's where the default Ubuntu PHP installs to. If you get something else, you can double check to make sure it's right by running the command which PHP, and it'll output where the PHP executable is. So hit the plus, select your PHP executable, and hit OK. Now you're ready to hit create a new project, name the project, save it to the folder for whatever LAMP stack you installed, be it VirtualBox or other, and you're ready to start coding. At this time, you can go ahead and click the little annotation in the bottom right hand corner to skip through the XAMPP setup tutorial to the conclusion. Now we're going to walk through how to install Eclipse. So the first thing is to navigate to the Eclipse downloads page, which I'll have linked in the description, and scroll down until you see Eclipse for PHP developers. Then download the version for Linux, which corresponds to your CPU architecture. Once the download starts, hit save file and wait for it to finish. Alright, once the archive finishes downloading, we can open it up and extract it to wherever you want. In my case, I'm going to extract it to my documents folder. And then we can quit. Once it's extracted, open up a command prompt, cd into the folder where you extracted it to, and run /Eclipse. This will launch Eclipse and start the initial configuration settings. So when you first launch Eclipse, every time you'll see this wizard that asks you to select a directory's workspace. The workspace is where Eclipse saves your code. So if you're using XAMPP, you're going to want to set this to that /opt/LAMPP/htdocs folder. If you're using Scotch Box, you're going to want to set it to your Scotch Box folder's public folder. That way, when Eclipse saves your code, it's saved wherever it's being put on the server so that you can access it directly through the server. Hit OK, and Eclipse should launch up with the workspace. Now, the first time you launch Eclipse, I recommend running through the IDE configuration settings just to make sure you have everything to your liking. Once that's done, you're ready to hit create a new PHP project and you're off to the races. So whether you installed XAMPP or Scotch Box, PHPStorm or Eclipse, you're now ready to venture into the wonderful world of software development, and man is it an adventure. Be sure to check out my channel for my other tutorials on PHP software development. as well as tutorials for other things from Linux to Windows to Mac, from software development to just random rants. Thanks for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.